We have moved on to the fourth major unit in this course, and this unit involves plant growth, development, and reproduction. For a plant to decide how much to invest in growth and reproduction, and for it to know what organs to develop during development, it needs to know something about its environment. So we will start this unit by talking about environmental perception as well as hormones, which are used to transmit information about the environment from one part of the plant to another part. The plant in the background on this slide is called dodder. And dodder is a cool plant because it is fully parasitic. So you can see that it is orange, not green. This is because the plant does not photosynthesize. And you can see too that it wraps around other plants. When it wraps around, it forms connections and it steals nutrients from them. So for a plant like dodder, perceiving its environment is really important because the other plants that it parasitizes are part of that environment. And so it needs to make decisions. For example, do I continue wrapping around this plant to parasitize it, or do I instead send off shoots towards other plants and seek new hosts? Similar ideas apply for plants that are not parasitic. They'll be making a range of related decisions. So in today's lecture, we're going to start by thinking about some different processes that require plants to have information about their environment. And we'll think about this for seeds as well as mature plants and plants that are reproducing. Next, we'll talk about different kinds of stimuli from the environment that a plant can sense. We'll go through a list of about 8 of those. Then we'll talk about how plants perceive the environment more specifically for one example, which will be gravity. As we go through the next couple lectures, we will also talk about how plants perceive other stimuli like light. And then we'll spend most of today's lecture talking about how plants send messages within their body. And we'll see that the molecules that do this are called hormones, and there are several different plant hormones. Let's start by thinking about decisions that a plant needs to make. We will start at the beginning of a plant's life cycle with seeds, and we can think both about seeds that have not yet germinated, as well as seeds that have germinated and the seedling is starting to grow. So starting with seeds, before they germinate, they have to know some things about the environment, such as whether it's warm enough that they will be able to grow, and whether it's wet enough that they will have a water source to power their growth and development. And even if they can sense that it's warm enough right now, they need to ask a related question. Will it stay warm, or might this just be one warm day and it will get cold again in the near future? So they can't know this for sure, but they need to have some way of making an appraisal or a best guess about this. Now let's imagine the seed does germinate. It has a whole series of additional decisions to make. For example, it needs to decide how tall should it grow before it starts to make true leaves. It can grow a very short distance, which saves resources and allows it perhaps to make larger leaves. Or it could grow a taller distance, it could grow higher, and this gets it closer to the light, which means it might have a better chance of photosynthesizing, but it could use up all of its energy reserves in doing so. So it needs to know something about the light quantity and quality to make this decision. And we're just assuming it knows which way is up. But that's really something that it doesn't just inherently know. Instead, it needs to be able to sense from the environment which way is up. The corollary of that is it needs to know which way is down. This is especially important for roots, which needs to grow downward. Once you get even just a couple millimeters into the soil, it's going to be dark. So the plant needs some way of figuring this out besides just moving away from the light. Going back to the stem, then it's important for the plant to know where light is, because light is not necessarily going to be directly above. For example, a plant might be growing under a leaf if it just germinated, or underneath some larger plant, and so light might be coming from a side. This means that it needs some way of perceiving where the light is such that it can grow in that direction. Now let's assume that the plant has established, it made the right decisions, and it has survived. It's big enough that it now has some more decisions to make. For example, it needs to know whether it should invest the carbohydrates and other nutrients it has stored to make more leaves, or whether it should invest them in making more roots. It needs a balance between those two organ systems, because if it has too many leaves and not enough roots, it will not be able to acquire enough water and nutrients. But if it has more roots and not enough leaves, it will not be able to perform enough photosynthesis to capture carbon. Just like a human or another animal, plants also have to think about how much resources to save and how much to invest right now. So just as you might decide how much you need to keep in the bank for future use and how much you can spend now, a plant needs to decide how much of its sugar reserves should be spent now for growth and how much of those sugar reserves should be saved for some point in the future. And something that plants save resources for is reproducing. This is costly because making flowers and fruits and seeds require both energy and nutrients. So a plant needs to decide, is this the appropriate time to do it, based both on the nutrient reserves in the plant and also on the environmental conditions. And so if a plant has enough resources to reproduce, it now needs to make sure it's the right time to do it. For example, it can ask, is this the right time of year to make flowers? Is it a time when pollinators will be available? Is it a time when other plants of the same species are likely to flower? Is there enough time to make seeds before a frost might kill the plant if it's not a plant that survives over the winter? So it probably needs to know something about temperature and something about light and something about the seasons to make this decision. Once the plant makes a flower, it needs to decide when should it open that flower. Many flowers don't just open at a random time and stay open for a prolonged period, but many flowers instead open in the morning or open in the afternoon or the evening. And some are predictable enough that people have even made clocks based on flowers. So they plant a whole series of different flower types, and depending on which flowers have most recently opened, they could estimate about what time it is. And another decision, after a plant has flowered, some of those flowers will have been successfully pollinated and some of the ovules will have been fertilized, but some might not have been fertilized, or some might be fertilized by bad pollen. So the plant needs to evaluate which flowers and seeds are worth keeping and which ones are not worth the investment and should just be aborted and dropped. I'm going to skip over this slide. Let's just go on. For an older plant or a sick plant, it needs to make some additional decisions. If a plant is being attacked, then it first needs to know something about what's attacking it. It could be an insect, it could be a fungus, it could be a bacteria or a virus. Related to this, it needs to have some method of dealing with stopping the attack. This could involve dropping off the sick part of the plant. It could involve making defensive chemicals. It could involve building stronger walls to deter the pathogen from moving further into the plant. And if a plant is damaged, maybe it's damaged by an insect or maybe just by a fallen branch, for example, then it needs to know this as well, and it needs to be able to initiate a wound response. So we've just talked about a whole slew of different ways, or different reasons, I should say, that a plant needs to know something about its environment. We'll spend the rest of the lecture not addressing all of these specific questions, but talking generally about how does a plant sense the environment and how does it send signals. So plants can sense a variety of different stimuli. And this is not a complete list, but this does cover most of the categories of what plants can sense. So they can sense a variety of chemicals. This includes oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air, and this is important for a plant deciding whether to continue keeping its stomata open to perform photosynthesis, or whether it's better to close those stomata and stop performing photosynthesis. Some plants will close their stomata, for example, until the amount of carbon dioxide in the leaves becomes low and the amount of oxygen becomes high. Those are bad conditions for photosynthesis. That might cause a plant then to open its stomata so it can acquire more carbon dioxide, and so the oxygen can be released. Another example of when plants need to sense chemicals is when symbionts or pathogens release chemicals. So symbionts might be fungi that form mycorrhizae. Remember, those are mutualistic connections between a plant and a fungus, so they can exchange resources. These also could include nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which we talked about provide a source of fixed nitrogen for the plants in exchange for carbohydrates. So in both of those cases, it's likely that the fungus or the bacteria will release chemicals into the soil, and that will be part of how the plant knows that they are there, so it then can make changes to allow them to connect. Pathogens also are likely to release chemicals, and by detecting those chemicals, the plant can get some idea of what pathogens are around and what is likely to imminently attack it. Another category of stimuli plants can sense is gravity. This is important for roots to grow downward. They can sense light, both the amount of light, the duration of light, and even something about the quality of light, whether it's relatively red or relatively blue in color. They can sense moisture levels, especially in the roots. They can assess temperature. Some plants also can perceive touch and will actually react to the touch, and we'll talk about that more in another lecture. And plants can sense when they've been damaged. So that gives us 7 different categories of stimuli that you should be familiar with. We're next going to talk about how plants perceive their environment. And for now, we are going to stick to the example of gravity. So gravity is important because root tips need to be able to grow downwards to get both deeper into the soil to acquire water, and also just to further anchor the plant lower in the soil. And it turns out that on the root, the part of the root that senses gravity is the very end of the root, which is the root cap. We talked about root caps during the anatomy portion of the course, and we said that this was the part that gets pushed through the soil. Some cells fall off as it does. This also makes a mucilage that helps lubricate the pathway through the soil, and it just protects the very important cells in the root apical meristem from damage. Another role that we did not talk about was sensing gravity. So the way that these cells sense gravity is they have extra dense starch grains that, because they are dense, they sink to the bottom of the cell. So this cube right here represents a plant cell, and you can see these 4 dark round grains. These are the starch grains. And whichever way the cell is oriented, they are going to fall to the bottom. Because they're at the bottom of the cell, the plant then can, or the cell is sort of aware of which side is the bottom. If it knows where the bottom is, it can figure out where the top is, and it can then convey this information upwards into the root, and this can influence which way the root grows. If this cell were turned on its side, then these starch grains would fall down to the new bottom side, and the root would have a way of perceiving that its orientation had been changed. That is one example then of how plants perceive the environment. We'll talk about how plants perceive light and some other signals in the next couple days. Perceiving the environment is not enough if the plant can't do anything with that information. So it's important that the plant can also respond. And there's a basic three-step process for a plant responding to the environment. First, it needs to perceive some signal. Then it needs to transmit information that this signal was received, usually to other parts of the plant. Then it needs to actually respond to that signal. The response could be either physiological, so it might do a process faster or slower, or it could be a growth response where it develops perhaps more leaves or more roots, for example. So the signals that get sent from one part of a plant to another part of the plant that lead to a specific response are going to be hormones. And hormones, so they are by definition signaling molecules, and they are always made in small quantities. There's just enough hormone to convey information, but it's not like nutrients where there has to be a large amount to cause an effect. And sometimes hormones will act in the place where they are made, but usually they get transported to some other location. We'll see examples where hormones get sent from the roots to the shoots, or from the shoots to the roots, for example. Because they're made in small quantities, but they can change both physiology and development, this means that even a small amount of hormone can have a large response on the plant. And this is equally true of hormones in animals. They are always present in small amounts, but they lead to big effects. There are several different plant hormones. There are 5 major hormones that we'll talk about in detail. And then there are 3 additional hormones that we'll talk about a little bit as time allows in other lectures. So let's focus right now on the 5 major hormones. These are auxin, cytokinin, abscisic acid, which we usually just call ABA for short, gibberellins, and ethylene. We'll talk about what each of those does. And we'll start with auxin. So auxin is probably the most important plant hormone. It's produced in many places in the plant, but the place in the plant we will focus on is the apical meristem. Remember, that means the very tips of each shoot. And auxin has multiple roles, but what we'll focus on here is that it promotes cell expansion and cell elongation. It does this by loosening the cell wall. Remember that cell walls are rigid. They're made of cellulose and other materials that link together. And this means that once they've hardened, the cell really can't get any bigger. But there's times when the cell needs to continue to elongate, or at least it needs to delay hardening until it gets as large as it needs to be. Auxin helps with this process. We won't talk about the specific mechanisms, but it does a couple of things that weaken the cell wall. Remember that water inside the cell, assuming the cell is well hydrated, it's always going to be pushing out on the cell walls, creating trigger pressure. Usually the cell walls push back in, and so nothing happens. But if the cell walls are loosened, then they won't be able to push in adequately, and as a result, the cell will expand. Once the cell's expanded to the appropriate size, then the cell walls will harden and it will not expand further than this. So because the auxin causes cell expansion and elongation, it can lead to growth of organs. For example, it could lead to leaves getting larger or fruits getting larger. Another function of auxin is that it promotes lateral root and adventitious root formation. So this is a cross-section of a root, and we looked at probably this very picture back when we talked about root anatomy. We said that new roots form by lateral roots growing out and eventually bursting through and becoming their own root. It turns out that this process is accelerated by the presence of auxin, and if auxin is taken away, then the process stops. A third effect of auxin is to suppress the activity of lateral buds. So this is still the same hormone, and this is something that we are looking at in lab, or maybe just looked at in lab. And so what we see is that when the apical meristem is present, then this is where, remember, auxin gets made. It's the site of production. So auxin gets made here, but then its place of effect is further down in the stem in this case. So it gets sent downwards in the stem, and it has the effect of suppressing the activity of lateral buds. It prevents the lateral buds that are associated with each leaf from becoming active, so they don't form lateral stems. That's what happens if the apical meristem is present. Now let's think about what would happen if the apical meristem is removed. Let's say it gets pruned off or bitten off by an herbivore. If this happens, then auxin is no longer getting made in the apical meristem because it's gone. And so now there's not auxin being sent downwards through the stem. That means the lateral buds are no longer suppressed. And if they're not suppressed, they'll be able to elongate. And they'll even be able to form new leaves off of the new stems that are being formed. And so going back to the lab we did with coleus, where we looked at the effects of pruning on the number of leaves, if we saw an effect, this would be why. Because once the apical meristem is gone, we've got longer and more lateral shoots, and with those additional shoots, we have more places where leaves can be formed. So that covers 3 different effects of auxin, namely causing cell elongation, causing suppression of lateral buds, and causing formation of adventitious and lateral roots. How can we use this in gardening? Well, one way we can use it is what we just talked about here. We can prune off apical meristems to get a bushier look for a plant. A second way we can use our knowledge of this in gardening is to create cuttings. So cuttings are what's formed when a piece of a shoot is cut off, such as this stem here, and then it is rooted to create a new plant. This is a kind of vegetative propagation, meaning that we've made a new plant without going through sexual reproduction. This new plant is genetically identical to the plant it was cut off from. So we're propagating the plant from cuttings. The problem is that if we cut a stem, some plants will make roots easily at the end of the stem, but most plants will not. Instead, we need to give them some signal that says, we want you to make roots down here. Well, remember these roots that are getting formed, these are adventitious roots, because they are roots that are coming off of a place where not typically associated with roots. And we know that auxin encourages the growth of adventitious roots. So what we can do is use a source of artificial auxin, and we can apply it to the base of this stem, usually just by dipping the stem into the powder that contains that artificial auxin. Then, because this is covered now with an artificial auxin, that will oftentimes lead to the formation of adventitious roots. Once they've formed, then this can be planted and will have some chance of growing into a new plant. So this is a great trick. One problem with it is that artificial auxin is likely to some degree a carcinogen. A carcinogen is a chemical that causes cancer, and obviously that's something we want to avoid. And because this is a hormone, it does not have to be received in large quantities, potentially to have this effect. So in the interest of caution, in case it is a carcinogen, it's better to handle this very carefully. And that probably means with gloves and possibly even with a respirator mask. This is an experiment I wanted to do in class, but because of this risk, we are not doing anything with rutone. The next hormone that we will talk about is cytokinin. Cytokinin, in some ways, is the reverse of auxin. In some ways, they complement one another. Cytokinin is made in the roots as well as other parts of the plants, but we'll focus on the roots for our purposes. And like auxin, it has several different roles. One role that we'll focus on is that it causes lateral buds to become active. So we just said that auxin suppresses lateral buds. Cytokinin encourages them. And remember, cytokinin is made in the roots. So over here on this plant, it's in a small pot compared to this one, and it also doesn't have very much roots. This means it's not going to make very much cytokinin, and it will not send very much upwards into the stem. That means these lateral buds are likely to stay dormant or inactive. This plant over here, though, you can see it's got a larger pot and it's got more roots. That means it can make more cytokinin that gets sent up into the stem, and that allows these lateral buds to become active, and we get growth of these side shoots. So here, cytokinin is doing the opposite of what auxin does. Auxin suppresses, and we get this. Cytokinin encourages their activity, we get this. So auxin and cytokinin can work together to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of roots for the shoots and an appropriate amount of shoots for the roots. Let's first think about what happens if the shoot system is large relative to the root system. This is not good for the plant because it means it will not have enough roots to get water and nutrients for the shoots. So the plant needs to fix this. However, if there's a lot of shoots, that also means there are probably a lot of shoot apical meristems, each one of which is producing auxin. Since there's not very much roots, there's not a lot of cytokinin being made. This means that the ratio of the two is going to be in favor of auxin, and auxin has the effect of suppressing axillary buds. If the axillary buds are suppressed, that means the shoots aren't going to grow very much at this time. However, remember, auxin also has the effect of encouraging lateral root growth. And so because we have a lot of auxin, we get a lot of root growth, leading to an expansion of the root system until it is large enough to match the shoot system. So the plant has become balanced again. Now let's think about the other situation where the plant has a lot of roots, but it doesn't have very much shoots. In this case, because it has a lot of roots, it has a large supply of cytokinin. But if it doesn't have very many shoots, it's got a fairly small supply of auxin. This means that axillary buds are going to be activated. They've got the cytokinin. They're not inhibited by very much auxin. And so with activation of axillary buds, the shoot system will get larger. However, Because there's not a lot of auxin, the auxin is not going to be encouraging root growth as much as it would otherwise, and so root growth will be slowed. So that means the shoots will be growing faster, and they will have the opportunity to catch up to the amount of roots that are there. So this is an example of two hormones that have opposite effects, but the joint effects of the two of them allow the plant to balance the relative investment in two different organ systems. We will move on now and talk about another kind of hormone. This is gibberellins. And gibberellins are made in multiple parts of the plant. We won't talk about all of those parts. They have a few roles. One role is to cause stem elongation. And there's a picture of this down below. What we can see here is a field of rice, or probably a rice paddy. And most of the rice is fairly short, but up here in the midground we see this one extra tall rice plant. This is called foolish rice. And it's called that because, I guess it looks a little bit silly, but these rice plants also do not make seeds, and so from the perspective of the farmer, this is not a good idea. Also, if the plant doesn't make seeds, it's not reproducing, so it's not great for the plant itself. It turns out that foolish rice is caused by a particular kind of fungus, and this fungus causes the stem to elongate longer. And the way it does this is by making a hormone that is very similar to gibberellins. The fungus makes it and releases it into the plant grows tall. You can ask yourself, why would a fungus want a plant to grow extra tall? Well, think about if the fungus is dispersed by the wind when it makes spores. Spores down here in the low rice aren't going to have a great chance of getting dispersed by the wind, but those up at the top of a tall plant will have a much better chance. So this is really a case of the fungus being able to manipulate the plant in a way that helps it spread its own spores. So one effect of gibberellins is to cause stem elongation. We'll be talking about this much more when we talk about agriculture. Several changes to plants that we've made in the last 50 or so years involve manipulating the amount of gibberellins such that we can make plants smaller. And we'll talk about why that's good for agriculture when we get to that unit. The second thing that gibberellins can do is promote fruit development. So, under natural conditions, seeds produce gibberellins, and some of those gibberellins leak out from the seed into the fruit that surrounds the seed. Those gibberellins then are a cue to the fruit that it should continue to expand. This is good because from the plant's perspective, if there are seeds present, it wants to make a fruit, so those seeds will be dispersed. However, if it's a flower that did not successfully make seeds, or it made very few seeds, then it's not worth the plant's investment to form a fruit around those seeds. And so if there's few or no seeds, there will not be a strong gibberellin signal, and the fruit will either stay small or not develop at all. But those flowers that made many seeds will have a lot of gibberellins, and that will send a strong signal and a larger fruit will develop. So this is useful for natural plants. It's also useful for us in agriculture. And one way it's useful is we can use it to get some kinds of fruit to make much larger fruit. For example, here on the right we have normal sized grapes. Then on the left we have grapes that were sprayed with gibberellins during fruit development. And by spraying on additional gibberellins, you can see we get much larger fruit, maybe fewer of them, but the grapes are larger in size. A related trick is used to form seedless grapes. So seedless grapes could be formed by spraying unpollinated flowers with gibberellins. In practice, I think what happens more is we find unusual mutants of grapes that even though they don't make seeds, they maybe make extra gibberellins, or they are just extra sensitive to gibberellins. But either way, they perceive that there's a lot of gibberellins in the fruit, even when seeds are not present. That then allows fruits to form, or even large fruits to form, in the absence of seeds. We will not say as much about the next hormone, which is abscisic acid, or we'll just call it ABA. It's produced in the roots as well as elsewhere in the plant. And wherever it is produced, it is done so in response to stressful conditions. It generally has the effect of suppressing activity and suppressing growth. So slowing growth is one effect. Another effect is that it causes stomata to close. So remember, stomata are the openings on leaves. They are surrounded by two guard cells. If the stomata is open, they look like this. And you can see the stomata itself is the hole here. These are the guard cells around it. Now, if their signal gets sent, let's imagine the roots are under stress. They can release ABA. ABA will travel all the way up from the roots through the stems and eventually into the leaves. It will be perceived by the guard cells, and when it is perceived, the guard cells will close down, like shown here, and the opening goes from being large to being very small or altogether sealed. And this is good under stressful conditions, because if it's stressful, then the plant may have trouble acquiring water. If it's having trouble acquiring water, it does not want to have transpiration of water out of its stomata. Knowing about ABA is useful for gardening or even for houseplants. And what's important here is that when we create stressful conditions, for example, by not watering a plant, then the plant is going to send an ABA signal up to its shoots and its leaves, telling it that it's under stress. Then we can water the plant and we can alleviate that stress. However, even after we've alleviated the stress, the ABA signal is going to linger. It does not go away as quickly as the stress goes away. And so what's going to happen is the plant will still perceive that it's under stress, even if conditions are better. This means that growth can be slowed. And so if you garden with vegetables, you may have experienced this, where you forget to water plants for a few days, they get kind of droughty and look unhappy. You then water them again, and they perk up, but they continue to grow very slowly. Part of the reason for this could be a lingering signal from ABA. And the last hormone that we are going to talk about is ethylene. Ethylene is a gaseous hormone, which is unlike all of the others. All of the others are particles that are going to be dissolved in water and will be able to move through the vascular system of the plants. Ethylene instead is a gas, and it gets released, and it spreads through the air like other gases. Ethylene causes the ripening of fruits. It also causes abscission, which is a fancy word for falling off. And this is true, it can cause abscission of leaves. It also causes abscission of flowers that abort, and it causes abscission of fruits that are ready to fall off the plant. And we use ethylene in all sorts of ways. One way we can use it is by causing fruits to ripen more quickly. So if you ever buy green bananas and you don't want to wait several days for them to ripen, you can use this trick. Find a paper bag and put inside all of your green bananas as well as one ripe or overripe banana, and seal the bag. When you've done so, then gas is going to diffuse from the overripe banana that's making a lot of ethylene, and it will diffuse into the other bananas that are not yet ripe. Because ethylene signals for ripening, it will cause those other bananas to start ripening. Then, as those other bananas start ripening, they will start producing their own ethylene, and that will cause them to ripen even more. And so This means that ripening causes more ripening, which means there's a positive feedback loop. So the process can accelerate, and even if we start with just one ripe banana, very quickly the other ones will become so too. This is also relevant to when we talk about bad apples. You've probably heard the expression, one bad apple spoils the bunch. Well, what does this mean? What it means is that if you actually have a lot of apples, you really want to make sure you don't have bad apples mixed in. Because if you have an overripe apple or a damaged apple, then it is likely, well, no, not likely, it's going to emit ethylene. And if it does so, it's going to cause the other apples nearby to accelerate their ripening too. So if your goal is to store apples for a long period of time, maybe you've filled your produce drawers with apples in the fall and you want them to last into winter. If this is the case, you want to be pretty careful to go through and look for any bad apples and remove them before this ethylene response occurs. We can use this knowledge of ethylene to help design bags for produce that will not cause over-ripening. And so, for example, we can think about an apple bag like this. And it might be a plastic bag, but if you look at it, you'll see that it's usually covered with hole punch size holes. One goal of those holes is to allow ethylene to escape, so it doesn't cause the apples to ripen before we are ready. We can also design mesh bags like this that have a similar effect. You also will see, if you want to spend a little bit more money at the supermarket, you can find bags for sale that are often called something like green bags. And what they are, they look like this. So here's the box, and here is one of the bags. And it has a sort of clay-y, waxy coating on it. And, well, the clay coating on it has the effect of absorbing ethylene. And because this absorbs ethylene, if you fill this bag with produce and put it in the fridge, then it's not going to go bad as quickly as other produce that is just stored in a normal plastic bag. Or at least that is the claim made by the manufacturers of these bags. This was on our list of potential laboratories to do this semester, simply to see whether fruits and vegetables in these bags last longer. In the interests of time, I sort of had to cut it for other activities, but it is an experiment you can try on your own. And that brings us to the end of today's lecture. I want to end with some final thoughts related to plant perception of the environment and how the signals are moved. First, remember that plants lack nervous systems, circulatory systems, and endocrine systems. And so it is much harder for plants to send a message than it would be for a mammal like humans. However, plants do have some systems they can use, especially the vascular system, sometimes the xylem and sometimes the phloem. And then in the one case of ethylene, we saw that diffusion of gas is actually used to move a signal around. There's other cases where the vascular system is not used, and instead a hormone gets sent pretty locally from cell to cell, let's say within a leaf or within a very small part of a root or a shoot. I want to emphasize that every hormone has multiple different effects. We focused on between 1 and 3 effects for each hormone, but if we made a complete list, then each list would probably have several things per hormone. Also, we focused on pretty simple effects of most hormones, with the one exception being how auxin and cytokinin interact with one another. But in general, hormones can work together to achieve similar goals, or they can overrule each other. And so for us to understand what a hormone will do in any situation, we really should know how much of the other hormones are also present. Along those lines, joint effects of hormones can cancel each other out, or they can sometimes lead to entirely different outcomes, where one hormone does one thing, another hormone does something else, but the two together do an entirely different third thing. And then the big lesson from today is that perception of the environment and the ability of plants to communicate information about this allow plants to develop and respond to their environment in a coordinated manner, so the shoots, roots, and other parts are all working together to help the plant achieve its highest possible fitness.